It is Lou here,
Ashley.
and we have our special guest, Shamika Vargas. We will get into all that. But you know how we do. We're going to do our moment of gratitude. I can start if you like.
Yes, absolutely. Take it off, Marlu.
Okay. So I recently got to reconnect with some high school friends, and first of all, I don't even be liking to run into people that I know or used to know. Like, I'm shy in the sense, but it comes off as awkward and distant. But it was no time. No time has passed. It was like, ooh, y'all still in my heart. Like, I love y'all. So it was great to connect and feel to still be able to be the different phases of who you are and transition into teenage to adulthood, and they're still there and able to I guess keep the pace, if you will, and we're able to still be cohesive is beautiful. Loved it. So I had me a great old time. So I'm just thankful for old friends that still feel very new.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
That's
Mhm.
important.
Yes.
I am grateful for just letting go. It could be as simple as, for example, I got a new car. However, it took me a long time to let go of my hoopty. It took a long time to let go of Rogue. I had her. I was just holding on to her for dear life. I just felt like she was such an extension of me that I was like, oh, gotta take her to the car shop, gotta take her to the doctor, I gotta diagnose her. What's wrong now? But I'm excited for change because now that I'm in my new car, I'm like, oh wow, this is nice. My drive is smoother. Oh, and now I know how it is when I reverse. I can see where I'm reversing into before. Yeah, so it's important to let go and embrace change, as little as that is a car, but it is important to embrace change. So I'm grateful for that. Trying to change and embrace change.
You can still honor Old Faithful for getting you through, but you gotta still want better for yourself, honey.
I know. So yeah, that's what I've been grateful for this past week for sure.
Love that. Love that. I think in this past week, one of the things I was conscious of is I've been working for myself for about a year and a half. And that's a huge change from being part of organizations and companies and kind of doing things how either it has to be done, how people tell you it has to be. And so one of the things I'm really grateful for is flexibility. Like this idea that I'm able to create the day structured in a way that works best for me and my body and my needs, that can manifest with okay, I can create a break in the middle of the day that lets me maybe cook a meal for later without having to cook late tonight. Or it may mean just getting on the phone with a friend or with my mom and being able to chat it up and really kind of have some nice conversation in the middle of maybe some heavy conversations that I'm having otherwise. So just that flexibility, I'm super grateful for, because I actually think it's allowed me to really reconnect with myself and what I need as a person.
Ooh, I love that.
I love that flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
Flexibility for self-care.
Yeah. Or reconnection. Just reconnection with self.
Get into it. I could talk about that all day.
I was going to say another episode.
Right. But in this week's episode, we're going to talk about something, I guess it could be a little heavy, but we're going to get into it. So we are going to discuss grief. And obviously, people have their own ideas of what grief is and what their experience is. But we have this wonderful therapist and licensed social worker, Shamika Vargas, and we're going to get into all of that. But let the people know who you are, what your specialty is. So, yes.
Absolutely. So my name is Shamika Vargas. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, as you mentioned. I'm in private practice as a therapist. I also do consultant work. I'm really supporting folks who are trying to practice in a more inclusive way, in a more anti-racist way. So doing a lot of gender and racial justice work as well is important to me in my work with clients. I'm predominantly working with Black and brown women, oftentimes first gen folks, but also just really, it tends to be that like, you know, some people will say that therapists and clients, they attract each other, right? Like you look for a therapist, you're looking for something, whether conscious or not. And that in many ways, the best relationships are the ones where the therapist is also kind of seeing themselves in their clients too, in some way, shape, or form. Like that creates connection. And so I'm finding that, you know, as folks who are dealing with perhaps being really successful in a lot of ways that on paper are important, but may be wanting to really work on things related to like their own familial traumas, relational traumas, just like inner work around like what's really important to them and what it means to be moving through the world in an intentional way. So I do a lot of work around really helping people reconnect with the body, reconnect with the self, so that they're really showing up for themselves and others, and not just always for others. Also, super important things I always got to throw out there. I'm currently based outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, but I'm from Brooklyn. I'm going to say that everywhere all the time. It wouldn't be me. I'm from Bed-Stuy specifically, though I spent quite a few years in Bushwick. So I'm going to give a little love to both. Also, I'm a Cancer sign. I'm the oldest of 5. I'm a geriatric millennial, and all of that matters. All of that matters. A geriatric millennial, that's how I enter the space, right? They ask that question. I'm Afro-Puerto Rican, Boricua, stand up. So like all of that, you know, I'm not going to throw in a whip out randomly, but I'm just saying, or maybe that was the random whip out, but that's it.
I love it. I'm here for it.
All of that comes in the room. All that comes in the room with me.
Yes, we love the energy, especially as native New Yorkers ourselves.
Yeah,
so we feel the love. We feel the love. I told you it's gonna be a good time, Ash. Told you.
I know. I was like, yes, I'm loving it. Yes.
So as we get into, let's get into it, because I'm about to I can take this whole thing left.
Yeah, but today we're here to talk about grief. We're talking about a topic we don't really like to speak about. We get a little comfortable of talking about it, but we need to talk about it. When I was on your page, I was like, yes, this needs to be something we should shed light to more. And I loved how transparent you were as well. But let's start from the tippy top. So can you just define what grief is for us?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to think of grief, right, is it really is an emotional response to loss. Like that's it in a nutshell. All the emotions that come up when we're responding to loss is grief.
I love that. It's so simple and it just makes sense. Like it just like,
right.
I get it. You know what I mean? So what can that look like?
Yeah. So super important. When we're thinking about grief, we're going to see like there's some elements that are emotional, like I said, right? Because it's an emotional response, but there's also physical elements, right? So if you yourself are even wondering, hey, it's interesting because in some ways, if I were to ask the question, have you ever felt grief before? Very few people wouldn't say yes, right? Even though it can be really hard to describe. When we're thinking about the emotions, you're going to see elements of like sadness. You're going to see elements also though of like yearning, right? Like that's actually an interesting element of grief is there's a desire or a yearning for the thing that was lost, the person that was lost, right? And I think that even in that explanation, we have to keep in mind that when we're talking about grief, our mind automatically goes to death, right? For most people, it automatically goes to the loss of someone in their physical form. But really, I think today we're going to be having a great conversation also around the fact that like grief is about loss, period, in so many different ways, right? We'll get into that. But the other interesting part about the emotional response to grief is that it isn't always sadness. Sometimes the response to grief is anger. Sometimes the response to grief is denial. Sometimes the response to grief is apathy, like a disconnect, right? A numbing. But typically you're going to see a yearning in there, like for almost the wish factor. I wish it could have been that way. Some people call that bargaining. If I could only turn back time, I should have done this. I should have done that. That's typically can be present in grief as well. then physically, you're going to see that it could be changes in appetite. It could be changes in sleep patterns. It could be a general fatigue, not really finding pleasure in things that used to be pleasurable, or it can just feel inconsistent. So sometimes feeling like I can laugh and sometimes feeling like I can't even laugh, right? And the fact that in many ways it comes in waves. It comes in waves, right? So even that inconsistency can be a frustrating part of grief, is not that it doesn't look the same the whole time either.
Mm-hmm. So I feel like that's referring a lot to what people call, what is it, the 5 stages of grief that people, typically, I guess, go through. You find that like it goes in the order that, what is it? What, like denial, bargaining, anger, like, can you paint a picture what it looks like?
Yeah. So the most important thing to know is that we wish it went in order. Like, because if it went in order, you could almost write it out like a roadmap, right? If you say, okay, well, this thing just happened, so I can't believe it. I'm in the denial phase, right? Well, okay, so then next after this is going to be anger, or after this is going to be bargaining, or after this is going to be depression. And then eventually I'll be at acceptance. But that is not actually what it looks like. What can happen, and, in my humble personal and professional experience, is like you can be backsliding and swooping. And like if you drew it on a piece of paper, it looked like this, right? You could be here today and here tomorrow and here. That's like, it just doesn't move in a straight line at all. I think that's actually the most turbulent part of grief. And one of the reasons why we kind of almost don't want to have anything to do with it, because it is not predictable. And, as humans, we kind of want to feel emotionally safe. We want to feel like we can be in control of things when so much is outside of our control. So if we at least know how to manage this, like, okay, I can deal with this loss because I know how to manage this element because I know what's going to happen next. But it's not like that. And so part of dealing with grief is actually being able to ride those waves. That's a huge part of it. Will all those stages kind of come up for people in grief? I would say so for the most part. But the interesting part is how much time you even spend in any of those stages can vary. Some folks may blip through a bargaining phase, or that really isn't a part of their process. So perhaps maybe they're not even going to go through all 5 stages. But again, not in order at all, even though we wish it would be.
And I feel like people wish that grief could be linear for them to even understand how to grieve. Does that make sense in a way? Like they wish they knew exactly that it was linear, that they knew or could understand it more. And I feel like because it's just so many emotions and it's so everywhere, I feel like it's just so much harder for people to just get through it too as well, in terms of that.
And some of it may feel predictable, right? Because if you do lose someone in their physical form, and we're talking about death, right? Then most people will say that feeling some sadness feels obvious. But if you ever think back to someone experiencing a loss, or if you've experienced a loss, you can almost take a look around the room. And did you ever see anybody really irritable? Did you see someone kind of snapping at people? Did you see someone really off to themselves? Did you see someone talking a lot and like speaking to everyone and making jokes and all this kind of stuff, right? No one in that room was grieving any less than the next person. No one. It was showing up for folks in the way it was showing up in that space. And after that grieving ritual, because funerals and memorials and all those things are actually grieving rituals, people will continue to mourn in their respective ways. Now, the trickiest part is actually when people do try to suppress their grief and push away from it and not pay it any attention. That's really where we can find, like, I think of it this way. Like, you remember those cartoons where like there'd be a hole in like a raft and they throw the white tape on it and then pop a hole on the other side and they throw the white tape on it. And it was just kind of a comedy of errors, right? You're just trying to plug up the holes. To me, when we don't actually attend to our grief, whether we're talking about death, loss, and any other capacity, relationships, grief from displacement, war, like so many different things that can cause grief, like we try to plug up those holes, it will pop somewhere else. It will pop somewhere else. It will show up somewhere else, even if you don't know that that's what it is, even if you don't realize that that's what's popping up for you.
Yes. So like you were saying, like, I mean, even going back to Ashley's gratitude, she could possibly have grief over losing her car. which was kind
Absolutely.
of fitting, as obviously like a loved one. It could be a relationship, everyone like, when things like those kind of losses happen, everyone's like, it's, it'll take time. Like you won't see it now, but later on, like it'll be okay or whatever. What other things do people might not realize that they might have grief over, but is actually very common?
So it's very common to have grief over something that could have been. Like we can
Mm.
grieve a goal that we didn't get to achieve. We can grieve a dream that we didn't get to. We can grieve like a woulda, coulda, shoulda, right? Like I think a lot actually even about things like fertility, right? Like people who grieve with fertility struggles, it's because of the what could have been. We may not even like a person may or may not have experienced actual pregnancy loss, but because they haven't been able to get pregnant, that's a desire. There is grief there, right? Not to mention all the grief that can happen with any kind of pregnancy loss, right? So there are sometimes when we even grieve the ending of a relationship, we're really grieving what we thought we could have had, right? Or one of the things that comes up in therapy a lot, everybody hold on. One of the things that comes up a lot, folks grieving the relationships they wish they had with their parents.
The potential.
The potential, past and even current. Like when folks sit in a chair and say, I just realized I'm never going to be able to have the brotherly, sisterly, motherly, whatever it is, relationship that I always wanted, that I thought I could, that I've seen on TV, that I saw my friend have. There's grief there too, to be able to say, I have to either decide to accept this for what it is eventually, right? I got to process stuff to get there, but eventually get to that. Or if I decide to walk away from this relationship, I got to grieve it anyway. So no matter what, like there's a grieving process that occurs, sometimes even when we stay connected to people.
Mm-hmm.
When you leave a job, you could be super excited. You could be like, I'm out. And you still are having to say goodbye to the friends you made. You could have been saying goodbye to the comfort that you had. Maybe you were just like, man, that spot on the corner with the sandwiches like that. I'm just, okay, I'm not going to be able to come out here like that, right? Like, it's not just negative things. Like in our minds, we think that grief only comes with changes that we inherently describe as negative, but we can actually be in the midst of transition and what we think of as a more positive change and still experience forms of grief.
It just literally dawned on me when you said that, because I think like sometimes, okay, my phone will always have throwback pictures or whatever, and I have a whole bunch of pictures of my twins, and I'll look at them as babies, and I just want to be like, I want to go back.
Mm-hmm.
Even all the sleepless nights and all the things, and I'm just like, why can't y'all be like two again?
Mm-hmm.
That's a form of grief. That is crazy.
That is absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because it reminds me of like that word that I used earlier, yearning. Sometimes how we can tell that there may be a grief there, even if it's short, right? Because perhaps you're able to process through that pretty quickly compared to
Yeah.
maybe another loss, right? But being able to honor like, oh, that's what I'm actually feeling in my body and in my heart is a yearning for those experiences that we had at that stage of my child's life that's different now. You're not going to have that again. That's a forever
Yeah,
goodbye.
that's the sad part.
That's a forever goodbye, right? And so that absolutely is a space to be able to lean in and connect and give yourself. And I think that for me, that also comes into play with like, I really believe in like grieving rituals. And we can talk about it a little bit later, but like, I think grieving rituals can be applied in so many different ways, big and small. But even like when we think about the things that we keep, right? Like, do you keep anything from those stages from your children, right? Because that's a part of like, not just grieving it, but being able to return to it later. And that's healing.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
she has blown my mind, Ashley. I don't got nothing to say.
Right. Because it's like now I'm like thinking back all these other times and I'm like, wait, I was actually grieving. Just like simple things of like leaving a job and how I felt during the process. And even there's times when I'm still at this current job, I still think of my previous job. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting to look at what encompasses, grieving, it's an
Right.
umbrella. It's not just particularly one thing. So
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting to put it that
I
way
want
for
to throw
sure.
another one. I want to throw another one in there that doesn't get talked about enough. I think that particularly for folks of color, there's the grief that happens every time we confront like community trauma, collective grief, right? When even as a nation, we hear about a school shooting, there's grief in that. When in our respective communities, we hear about police brutality or the loss of life in some particular way, violence against Black trans women, like all those things create levels of grief as well, right? There is even grief in recognizing that the more we know about our history, the more we have to also be like, why I live here? Why do I live here? Why, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not supposed to live here, you know? I say it as a joke, and yet that's because humor is one of the ways that I cope. But the reality is, I sometimes think to myself, there's a reason why when the temperature drops below 68, I'm cold because I'm not supposed to live here. That's not like who I'm. But what are the things that had to happen? And then we're talking about colonialism. We're talking about cultural genocide. We're talking about displacement. We're talking about war, about exploitation, things that happen on a systemic level that have real life impact on us. Like, why are we actually here? What happened to some of our respective home countries that we don't live there anymore? And if you go even further back, obviously we know collectively in terms of like transatlantic slave trade, right? Like, we are not supposed to be in the spaces we're in anyway, right?
Right.
And what happens when we allow ourselves to even have that space to grieve that we are making the best of a life that in some ways isn't supposed to be the life we were supposed to have? A lot.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Especially nowadays with the way the world's going. I'm like, okay, so which country would I go to like that I can see myself like, you know what I mean? Because besides the fact that I want to see people who look like me, I want a place that serves our people like real food and like, that you don't have to. I'm sure colorism exists everywhere, but not that like my son would be gunned down just because he's a black boy. You know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And you think about those things. It's true. And then grieving, like, it almost feels like is like, can I actually do something about it? And then that hopelessness almost.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? But
Mm-hmm.
then also in what you were saying, sometimes there's grief in being almost too hopeful. Some people might think is hope, but it's potential that's not there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's so many
Yeah.
elements, right? Like we could, like there are just so many pockets, right? There's anticipatory grief, right? If you're caring for someone who's suffering from like Alzheimer's or dementia and you're losing them slowly, right? Or someone has another chronic terminal illness where you know that loss is at the end. There's grief that happens sometimes before the actual loss, right? There's cumulative grief, right? Cumulative, there we go. Grief, right? Which is that you may have experienced losses before and maybe you haven't processed them and maybe another loss occurs and maybe that's the one that feels like the straw that breaks the camel's back. And really that may just mean like an outpouring of like of emotion and overwhelming, of flooding, right? But it is true, like there are all these elements where it's just like even in our hopes and our dreams and not knowing how much we can even cling to that, there's grief in that. There's a grief in not feeling like there's a stability and a security that we can guarantee almost.
Right. So now, like, is there a time limit to grief?
No.
Is there?
But here is where time matters. So for some folks, right, and I'm very skeptical when it comes to like, too much like formal diagnosis around stuff. And I'll tell you why. Number one, because we know a lot of that really has to do with like insurance and systems, and that doesn't take into account people. And a lot of those systems are also not even, has never been created with Black and brown people in mind. And if we were in mind, it was pathological right from the beginning. So I say that very concretely to say, some folks will say that grief, you're supposed to work through grief anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. And if you are still struggling with grief after 2 years, that means that there's a problem. I have to amend that, right? Because to me, what I really think becomes most important, and this is where I would recommend connecting with like a licensed professional, especially if they are, like not an expert, but even well-versed in like grief, right? Is because grief doesn't have a time limit. So there's no such thing as like 6 months from now, I'm not going to I'm not going to care. Like I'm over it. Like I'm like, you know what I mean? You lose someone you really love and you're like, but that's all right. 2 years from this date, I'll be fine. No, what I think people are really trying to pay attention to is whether there's any kind of, what's the impact on your functioning on a day-to-day basis and whether there's any improvement. So now if in the first 6 months, let's say, you are having trouble every day, like you're really pulling yourself to go to work, to do all that stuff, like that's valid, that's reasonable, that's all that stuff. And that may still be valid a year out and all that stuff. It may always be valid that there's something that's coming up. But really all you're wanting to check in with is like, is this impacting my functioning in a way that feels debilitating to the person? Or if there are folks who are concerned about their loved one, it's like, what is it that you're seeing? Is it really causing harm or is it uncomfortable for you, right? The person's still talking about it. There's some people who think that's a problem 2 years out, right? That might be the healthiest thing that person is doing. So whether you're the caregiver, the loved one, or the person experiencing grief, is this actually impacting functioning? Like, are you unable to go to work, to go to school, be in relationship with people you love and you desire to, and you are having trouble, right? Because I think another related question, if I may, oftentimes is around like the difference between grief and depression.
Right.
And when we talk about stages of grief and we recognize one of the stages is depression, we're like, well, then we're on a chicken or the egg kind of conversation. And it is complex. I think the difference is recognizing that, like, again, in grief, there's typically a yearning and a focus, something that is connected to, where depression can be just big and kind of almost encompasses life in general, or can actually be self-focused, like feeling negative about myself, not just about like a loss and all of that. But the reality is that you could be suffering from depression before you experience a loss. So now you're grieving and you're experiencing depression. And yes, grieving can become depression. So the lines between that, oftentimes we need some support in kind of parsing through. I do think that if a person, again, if they're concerned or if someone else is concerned about someone as to whether this is grief, whether this is depression, whether the grief seems to be, some people will call it complicated or stuck, where the person is having trouble kind of moving forward at all, then it's best to really connect with someone that's able to support as a licensed professional. Also, support groups can be really helpful because peers, we just learn from each other. And it feels good to be in a space, even when what we're talking about hurts, it feels less isolating to be able to be in a space with other people who can, who like your experience is resonating with theirs and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. So, what are some tips for people who are experiencing grief? Like, and please get into these grief rituals because I'm very curious about
I've never heard of this, so yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. So a couple of things in terms of like whether you're the one experiencing the grief and you're wanting to know like what are some things that help. Being connected to people helps, right? Like being able to understand, to try to understand what you need, but recognizing sometimes you don't know, right? So just trying to stay open to people can be helpful, and particularly reaching out to people if you need and or want them is helpful. If there is a way, if you feel that you're able to communicate depending on the trust in the relationship to tell them exactly what you need, cool, even better, right? But I'm actually going to say for those who are trying to support someone who's grieving, like pay attention to that, right? Like sometimes just checking in on someone and being able to say, hey, just checking in on you, right? Like being able to know, is there something service wise you can do for them? Like, hey, would it be helpful for me to bring you some food? Would you rather that I send you like a gift card for DoorDash or Uber Eats? Would you rather I drop something off? Hey, who's taking care of your laundry? Do you need me to do that? Do they have children? Do you need me to give them a ride to school? Like, see if there's a way you can actually, because in grief, showing up for life is hard, right? Like having to be like, I got to check off what on the to-do list, throw the whole list away, right? So if you're supporting someone, you want to try to see if you can like lean in that way. Also leaning in and just being able to let people know, hey, if you want to talk, I'm here. No pressure, no force, but being there. Because another thing that sometimes happens is that people who are grieving feel like they might be inconveniencing you or making you sad or putting something on your shoulders if they want to talk about the loss, whether relationship, death, like whatever it may be, right? And if you kind of signal to a person that you don't really want to hear it, like a person absolutely will receive that message, right? The other thing you want to stay away from, though, is one of the things that many people do, and they do it with, good intentions, but as they say, like the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? Is whenever we tell people that we know what they're going through, we do not. When we say, oh, like, I know exactly what you mean. Oh, I've been there. Like, it doesn't even matter if you've had a similar loss. You still don't know how a person feels because the nature of our relationships are just different. You could lose your mom and you could lose your mom, God forbid, but you could have had a great relationship with your mom and you had a terrible relationship with your mom, or you had a strained one, or it was good at the end, but bad in the beginning. Like, there's so many intricacies that that just doesn't wind up being helpful. Anything that's like trite or cliche when they're like, oh, they're in a better place, or at least this, all of that is invalidating. All of that invalidates a person's experience. That pain is palpable right now. No one needs like the Hallmark version of like, it's okay because, right? Sometimes people experience loss and they just receive all these messages that really wind up being hurtful. You have a pregnancy loss and people are saying, well, you can have another child. What? At least you have a kid. What? Those are real things people say. And I promise you they mean well. And I also promise you they are hurting people by saying those things, right? So even again, the platitudes around like they're in a better place, they're this, you don't know where they are. And it doesn't matter. You don't have
what someone believes in.
Exactly. You don't have to. They don't have to. That doesn't matter. Is being able to really just be sorry and hold space for a person, right? That condolences that I think of it as journeying alongside someone. I'm going to sit with you if you want to talk. I'm going to sit with you in silence. I'm going to go wash these dishes for you. Like, find your space, find a way, right? Don't crowd people, but find like that balance and pay attention. See what a person may be messaging to you, right? Now, when we talk about grieving rituals, we actually all participate in really ritualistic behavior in general as like human beings, right? I always think of it as like, if I ask people, in what order do you wash your body every day? Almost everyone actually knows. Like, they'll be like, I wash this first and that first and then this and then this. That there's an order that we're not even paying attention to. We just do it. How you get ready in the morning. But like, we do rituals, and rituals are a way that we feel safe, that life feels dependable and reliable. So when we think about grieving, one of the most famous grieving rituals is what we think of as funerals and memorials and services and all of that. But grieving rituals can be things like that, and can be as small as like how you decide to honor the thing or the person you've lost. So I'm going to give a couple examples. You're moving out of an apartment. You're excited to move out of the apartment. But this was your first apartment outside of your family's house, or your first apartment single, or your first apartment with children or without children. Can you create something to honor that, right? Is it like some people, you can talk to your house. You can say, thank you, like, thank you, house, for XYZ memories. Touch the wall, right? Use your 5 senses, touch the wall, touch parts of your house. Sit there and really be like, I remember this, like telling stories, even to yourself or to a thing, an object, can be part of a ritual to honor that, right? We can write letters to a thing, to a person. We can create ways to hold memories, right? Like, some people may call them even altars or shrines, depending on people's like religious comfort or connection, right? You can create little spaces in your home to remember someone, to remember something, right? And sometimes if it's a breakup or a loss, right? Like, we like to write things and then burn it, right? Like, or put it in the water, let it break apart. Like, there are so many different ways to do that. Listening to music that your loved one enjoyed, or something that brings a memory of the two of you together, cooking a meal, going to a special place, perhaps being by a body of water or in nature. Like, the most important part of grieving rituals is that you want to think about what it is you're grieving, or who it is you're grieving, and what is important to you and or to them that creates that connection. So the good news about that is there's never a right or wrong. Nobody's going to roll up on you and be like, what? You were coloring as a grieving ritual? That's wrong. No, because perhaps you were coloring a Golden Girls coloring book. I have one. But if that was their favorite show, or that was some show they put you onto, or used to watch that with them, that's also a grieving ritual at that point. Printing pictures is a grieving ritual. Deciding you want to even just put photos up, making your phone backdrop a picture of someone or something, right? So you pick the thing. If, for example, if we took it to the other part where I was saying, if we were grieving displacement, right? If we were saying, I'm really feeling disconnected from my family's home country or where I used to live and all that stuff. Yeah, taking a trip can be part of that, but also it can show up in different ways, connecting with culture, connecting with spaces that remind you of that, going to places that remind you of that, depending on your ability to reconnect directly or not. Those are some examples. Also, feel free if, as you're hearing me say that, like what pops into your head? Like, is there something that you're like, is this a grieving ritual? Can this be a grieving ritual?
It is a grieving ritual. I say that because me and Marlou, we have a friend, for example, she moved to Connecticut. She lived in the same apartment building for like 10 years in the Heights. And the night before, our friends came over, we spent the night, we joked about times, memories, we cracked jokes like, oh, this is the last night we're gonna hear loud music in this, in the surrounding area. It was like a whole grieving process in that apartment. And we woke up the next morning, got her things, and like I remember her just crying along the way to Connecticut as we started, her new transition into life. Just that whole moment in itself, that moment was actually, when I think about it, was a whole grieving ritual.
A whole grieving ritual. Goodbye parties.
That you're mentioning it, there are things that we do as rituals.
Even in jobs, think about like goodbye parties, right? Like at workplaces, going away, like that is a grieving ritual, acknowledge it or not.
Even when it's in celebration, it's still part of the grieving. And I guess it helps when you frame it that way and you call it that, you realize that it's not all negative and sad.
No. You could argue that that is part of the acceptance part of grief. Like, you know what I mean? You're honoring and celebrating your friend is moving to this place. This is an exciting change. You've accepted that your relationship might look different. The distance may require you to connect a different way. But on the road to acceptance is like, let's honor and remember everything we had here and allow ourselves to feel that. And we can laugh. We can cry, we can sing, we can dance. Like, I actually realized I forgot to mention all those as part of grieving rituals. We can sing, we can dance, right? Like, we can cry. Like, those are all part of grieving rituals too. I want to also add that sometimes we only think of grieving rituals on like anniversaries, especially when we're thinking about the loss of a loved one or the loss of a job or something, a termination, end of a relationship. We kind of only think of it on like sometimes almost an annual basis, or like maybe if it's this person's birthday. And I definitely would encourage kind of building space out throughout the year to really kind of practice grieving rituals as you see fit, right? But not this idea that it only has to happen on the anniversary of the occasion or on a person's birthday or in that particular way.
This is true. I love me some music. So if it's a song that it's like, hey, we first heard this or whatever, or, and sometimes I guess that can also happen without you knowing. If you hear the song and you're like, oh, you know what I mean? It brings you back to that place or that time or that person. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I love that.
And please, please, please don't ignore people who are grieving, right? And that sounds kind of like, what do you mean don't ignore? But I always think about like the fact that sometimes we can feel so uncomfortable because we also think we have to know exactly what to say, that we start to avoid people who are grieving. And that just adds to a person's isolation at a time that is already super heavy. So yes, it can be delicate to balance, like giving people space, but it is okay to be checking in, letting them know, hey, just checking in on you. Like, hey, do you want to talk? Hey, again, asking what they might need. But the avoidance piece, that winds up being almost more in our discomfort. We're actually making ourselves more comfortable because we're just like, all right, I'll avoid it totally. Another person may be feeling really alone.
Yeah, I think especially how you said, most people don't want to be seen as an inconvenience, but essentially all as humans, we want to be seen. So even if you're not going to acknowledge it or you might not be ready to receive it, the fact that you're like, okay, someone out there can see, what I'm going through, checking in on me. Hey, I thought about you, even if you're not bringing up whatever the situation might be. Yes, that's amazing. Yes, it's very helpful, I would say.
And it's true.
In some ways.
I'm sorry. I was also saying, like, it's true. Sometimes when someone is grieving, like, I know sometimes for me, I can get awkward. I'm like, I don't know what I should do or how I should approach them or how I should, speak with them. It's like I'm trying to feel them out or see what I can do. Or sometimes I'm like, maybe they don't even want me around. So it's like,
Mm-hmm.
I've learned now as I get older just to, just be present and to show them that I'm here,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
previously I used to be super awkward. I didn't even know where to start when I had someone around who's like grieving.
Yeah. For something that's so prominent in our lives, like there's no one who's untouched by loss, right? Like even we just think about death, like nobody's getting out of here alive. And yet and yet somehow we like, and I'm speaking I'm making a generalization, of course, but so for so many of us, we almost are not really taught how to actually talk about grief, how to be present with each other. So we feel awkward. So we feel pressure. So we feel like we can't, right? But it's one of the unifiers in many ways. We will all experience some kind of a loss. Most folks will experience multiple losses throughout a lifespan. So the ability to connect is there, right? Like or at least the material to connect over, right? And we wind up having to really kind of lean into it.
Man.
Mm-hmm.
That just it created an epiphany, because if you think about like we're first generation or whatever, and our parents had to, even if it was on, you weren't fleeing a war-torn country, they left their home, you know what I mean, and they had to learn how to survive. And I don't think there's probably a whole lot of delayed grief, even if it's decades later,
Absolutely.
and they had to just go and pick up. And I think we probably get past that down too, that,
Mm-hmm.
just keep going. You might hear them be like, oh, when I was back home, it used to be like this, but that's probably, you just get that glimpse and
Mm-hmm.
that's it.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes we can get a sense too, like what do folks talk about, like when they got a couple drinks in them or something, right? Or when they're feeling super emotional, or it's the holidays. Those might be the little bits where we may hear parents, caregivers, family members kind of share a little bit of the stories that they're carrying. And I would definitely argue that, for many of our parents and caregivers in that generation, I don't think they would even necessarily name what they are feeling as grief, or name what they have felt as grief. But to your point, what it takes to have to pick up and move into another space and create another life and say goodbye to all the people, the places, even if you're coming, but you don't know when you're coming back. You don't know if you're ever coming back, right?
And a lot haven't gone back.
A lot never go home again, right? And so what does that mean for a person in terms of what you do with those emotions and feelings? And for sure, how does that also filter into the next generation, like you said, where we start to teach, well, I had to deal with it, and I, there's no time. There's no time to talk about that. If I talk about that, I can't do anything. It's like that thing around survival, right? Like in order for me to survive, I have to cut that part of myself off, compartmentalize, put it away. If I ever let that part out, forget about it. Maybe I'm not even going to feel like I'm functioning. Like maybe I won't be able to hold it together if I do that. But then I'm going to teach my kids that that's the way we deal with loss in general, even if the losses are different.
Whew, clearly we could go on, but listen, we just want to thank you so, so much.
Thank you
for meeting with us. Where can the people reach out to you? Where can they find out? Where can they get the gems that you have to give?
Thank you. If people would like to hear more from me, you can find me on Instagram and TikTok at @therealheal_NYC. That's the best way to reach me at this time. And if folks are interested in working with me, I don't currently have availability right now, but life changes and ebbs and flows. And so folks can also feel free to shoot me an email at vargasshamika@gmail.com.
Just wonderful. We're going to take you however we can get you. So we will be stalking your page. Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me out here and for creating space for us to talk about something most folks need to talk about, but don't want to talk about.
Right.
So let us know how y'all feel about this episode. Please make a comment. Let us know your thoughts. How are you grieving? What loss are you dealing with currently? And how are you coping with it? Let us know your thoughts, all right? Till next time, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.